Good day, everyone. Before we start dissecting the entirety of our assigned novel, let me ask you one question. Have you ever gone insane because everything seemed too much to handle? From all the unsaid feelings, untold traumas, and unresolved memories that propelled your mind to go infernal as you witness your life crumble down like a speck of dust in a wide sea. Here's Tony C. and I, Leonardo Prudencio, to analyze, comprehend, and discover what really entails the novel titled Wide Sargasso Sea, written by Jean Rhys. To start our novel analysis presentation, first of all, let us introduce the author of the story, the one who is responsible for creating this masterpiece. It's none other than Jean Rhys. Ella Gwendolyn Rhys Williams, or also known as Jean Rhys, was a British novelist who was born on August 24, 1890, in Caribbean island of Dominica. Her father, William Rhys, was a Welsh medical doctor, while her mother, Mina Williams, was a Creole, meaning Rhys' mother, Mina Williams, was of mixed European and black descent. Because of this fact, Jean Rhys was sent to England when she was 16 because of her difficult relationship with her mother. She attended the first school for girls in Cambridge, in which she was bullied and ostracized as an outsider because of her accent. She attended two terms at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London by 1909 with hopes of becoming an actress. However, because of her accent, the instructor advised her father to take her home. But passion still flamed inside Jean heart as she worked as a chorus girl with stage names like Vivienne, Emma, and Ella Gray, and she toured around Great Britain. For her personal life, she became a mistress of the wealthy stockbroker Lancelot Gray Hugh Smith after her father died in 1910. She also suffered a near-fatal abortion that prompted her to write one of her novels titled Voyage in the Dark, which tackles about a young girl named Anna Morgan who moved from her Caribbean home to England. Sounds familiar, right? Jean Rhys had three husbands throughout her life. During the 1920s, she married William Johann Marie Lenglet, a French-Dutch journalist and songwriter. They had two children, a son who died young and a daughter who lived mostly with her father. They divorced in 1933. In 1934, Rhys married Leslie Tilden Smith, an English editor. They traveled back to Dominica, the first time Rhys stepped her feet on the land since she left for schooling. She found her family estate deteriorating and island conditions less agreeable. Therefore, she took care of some financial affairs along with her brother Oscar. Tilden Smith died in 1945. 2 years later, Rhys married Max Hammer, a solicitor who was a cousin of her previous husband. Jean Rhys was known as an avid fan of Ford Madox Ford, an English novelist. She cited him as an inspiration for her works. Ford applauded Jean Rhys for her singular instinct in form. It was Ford who suggested for her to have a pen name. Instead of her real name, Ella Williams, she underwent a pseudonym named Jean Rhys. Jean Rhys died on May 14, 1979, at the age of 88 years old in Exeter, United Kingdom. And there is a lot of notable work on her back. These are the followings: The Left Bank and Other Stories, written in 1927. Postures, the novel, 1928. After Leaving Mr. Mackenzie, novel, 1931. Voyage in the Dark, novel, 1934. Good Morning Midnight, novel, 1939. Tigers Are Better Looking, with a selection from the Left Bank, stories, 1968. Penguin Modern Stories 1, a collaboration with Bernard Malamud, David Plante, and William Sansom in 1969. My Day, Three Pieces, Stories, 1975. Sleep It Off Lady, Stories, 1976. Smile Please, an unfinished autobiography, 1979. Jean Rhys, Letters, 1931 to 1966, 1984. Early Novels, 1984. The Complete Novels, 1985. Tales of the Wide Caribbean, Stories, 1985. The Collected Short Stories, 1987. And lastly, Let Them Call It Jazz, Stories, 1995. So I know some of you might be wondering, what is her writing style? Jean Rhys' style in writing was described as elliptical, fragmented, discontinuous, and very poetic. It uses a lot of repetitions that made her one of the most renowned postmodernist writers due to the fact that her novels are mostly fragmented and breaking the norms in writing. She was known to be a feminist writer as her stories mostly revolved around the conflict of a main woman character and how she rises through her problem. One main example of it is Voyage in the Dark that she wrote in 1934. Voyage in the Dark entails the sufferings of Anna Morgan, the main character in the story, and how she handles all of the problem. The novel tackles the issue then of abortion, and Reese responded to it modernly by having Anna aborted her child and starting her life all over again, thus giving a new feminist perspective when it comes to pregnancy and decision making. Also, Jean Rhys was known to be a voice for the voiceless. The characters in her stories are mostly marginalized like her, a Creole, or everyone that is marginalized. This is where we lead us to her magnum opus, the most successful work she has, The Wide Sargasso Sea. Here is the book cover of Jean Rhys' novel Wide Sargasso Sea. Wide Sargasso Sea is the story of Antoinette Cosway, who becomes the mad woman in the attic. She is a Creole woman living in Jamaica shortly after the abolition of slavery. The point of view of Mr. Rochester is bookended by the views of Antoinette herself, growing up and later in the attic of Thornfield Hall. In the novel, Reese tries to explain Bertha Mason's personality from Charlotte Brown's Jane Eyre. Reese was interested in discovering what led Bertha Mason to lose her mind. Reese adds conflict to her plot in this way. There are conflicts between freed slaves and their former masters, widespread prejudice towards black people, and differences in worldviews between the island's New English immigrants and the island's longtime white plantation owners. Men and women are at odds with one another as they attempt to satiate their wants through their partnerships. The protagonist must contend with an internal conflict between her emotional and rational states of being, which is the final and most difficult conflict in the story. Due to its rich and oozing ambition to discover what really happened to woman in the attic in Jane Eyre, many literary theorists find Wide Sargasso Sea as something that is rich in portraying the damaging effects of colonization on conquered people and the debilitating consequences of sexual exploitation of women. Another group of readers, those interested in multiculturalism, might be drawn to Wide Sargasso Sea for the insider's views that Reese provides of 19th century life and culture on a Caribbean island. In addition, based on her background, we could see that Jean Rhys took an inspiration from her life of being a Creole in England that was reflected through the main character in Wide Sargasso Sea, which is Antoinette Cosway. The Wide Sargasso Sea received so much honor. the Royal Society of Literature's Heinemann Award and W. H. Smith Award. The book was also chosen by Random House as one of the top 100 novels published in the English language in the 20th century. After giving a brief detail about what Wide Sargasso Sea is all about, let me tell you about its literary genre. Wide Sargasso Sea is considered as metafiction. A prose narrative form known as metafiction focuses on the process of creating fictional works. A novel about a novelist writing a novel, with the protagonist matching the author's identity and each book having the same title, is one of the most obvious examples of a metafictive work. Such a strategy goes against both the tradition of the novel, which for more than 200 years has insisted that the form be a representative account of happenings in the world, and aesthetic theory, which has dominated since it was proposed by Samuel Taylor Coleridge in the late 18th century, that the reader of such work will willingly suspend disbelief. Wide Sargasso Sea was considered as metafiction based on the fact that it serves as the commentary on Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Wide Sargasso Sea retells the whole story of Jane Eyre from the point of view of the woman in the attic. Rhys vividly explained how the woman got in the attic, the real thing that happened between her and Rochester, and her mental illness that caused her downfall. In Jane Eyre, the woman in the attic was considered as the antagonist that tore down Mr. Rochester's and Jane's love life. However, in Wide Sargasso Sea, the woman in the attic was treated with respect, describing her situations that catapulted her to go infernal. All of her unsaid feelings, untold traumas, and unresolved memories that propelled her to go insane as she watched her life crumble down right in front of her own very eyes. Something that Charlotte Bronte failed to elaborate on in the story, as her main focus on Jane Eyre is the romance, not the characterization per se. It challenged the narrative of Bronte and explaining the other side of the story, told in the perspective of Antoinette Cosway, the woman in the attic. Now that you have learned all the knowledge you need to know about the White Sargasso Sea, I think it is time for us to dwell deeper more on the plot and elements found in the novel. Here's my partner, Tony C.
Let us now move on to our characters, specifically the main ones. The first one that we have is Antoinette. She is the protagonist of the novel and one of the narrators in it. She is the daughter of ex-slave owners, namely Annette Cosway and Alexander Cosway. Her character is based on Bertha Mason from Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Being neglected by her own mother, Antoinette experienced an emotional decline in her life. As a white Creole, Antoinette struggled to find her place in their community. This behavior of hers continued to worsen when she got married to an English gentleman who was unloving towards her, which resulted in her having the similar fate of her mother, showing signs of insanity or exhibiting madness. Speaking of her mother, next one that we have is Annette. Annette is the mother of Antoinette, who is considered to be young, beautiful, and a Creole. In Antoinette's eyes, Annette exhibits madness. Annette constantly feels scared and abandoned since she was always gossiped about by the ex-slaves around her neighborhood. Then, by the same people, they burned Annette's house down, which signals the last straw of her madness. Being nearly killed by her own wife, her husband, Mr. Mason, left her in the care of a black couple who mistreated her. After a while, she died while Antoinette was at the convent school, though the novel did not specifically mention anything about the cause of her death. Moving forward, we have Mr. Rochester. Mr. Rochester is the English husband of Antoinette and a narrator in the novel as well. However, despite having to narrate a part of the novel, he remained nameless because Antoinette referred to him only as that man or my husband. From Jane Eyre, Mr. Rochester accepted the arranged marriage offered to him by Mr. Mason. Mr. Mason. Mr. Mason is the second husband of Annette. He was a wealthy English businessman visiting the West Indies to make money. After being captivated by Annette's beauty, they immediately got married and stayed at the house in Colibri. However, he ignored the pleas of Annette that they were in danger if they stayed there any longer. He believes that the newly emancipated Negroes are lazy and would not do such a thing. His ignorance, though, led to the fire in their house, which caused Pierre's death. After this incident, Mr. Mason slowly abandoned her wife and Antoinette. Christophine. She is a servant gifted to Annette before by her first husband, who was a slave owner, for their wedding. Christophine is the one who explained everything about anything to Antoinette. Even though the Causeways reached rock bottom financially, Christophine still remained loyal. She believes in using obeah, or African diasporic spellcasting practice, which elevates her authority as she also spoke in multiple languages and dialects. Seeing as Mr. Rochester is slowly challenging the wits of her wife, Christophine advises Antoinette to leave his husband and be independent. Pierre, the younger brother of Antoinette who was sick. He can neither walk nor speak. But despite this, he was still Annette's favorite child. Now that we are done with the characters, let us now move on to the settings. Now, Wide Sargasso Sea is set during the 1840s in the following places: Jamaica, Windward Islands, and England. We have to take note that it was also during this time that the Emancipated Act was already passed. Next that we have is the conflict. Now we have 4 conflicts in the story, 2 of which are man versus self, and the last 2 are man versus society. Now, let's start with letter A, man versus self. Antoinette finds herself in a difficult situation due to her cultural differences. Being a white Creole, she feels indifferent in her community in Spanish town, Jamaica. The second man versus self conflict that we have is when Antoinette slowly loses herself as she hallucinates consistently. She becomes disassociated from herself and her surroundings. She switches between fantasy and reality, her present and her long past. Next that we have is man versus society. The first man versus society conflict is when a financial agreement between Antoinette and Mr. Rochester happened through a wedding. Their relationship is to be the cause of most of the conflicts in the novel. Through marrying a man, by law the woman must give all her riches to her husband. And the last conflict, which is a man versus society, the newly emancipated Negroes despise Antoinette and her family as her parents were notorious ex-slave owners, especially her father Alexander Causeway, because he was abusive and cruel to the slaves when he was still alive. Moving forward, let us now move on to our plot. Now, the first thing that we have on our plot is introduction. Mr. Mason marries Annette and lifts them off from financial struggles. We can see here from the textual evidence, I was a bridesmaid when my mother married Mr. Mason in Spanish Town. Christophine curled my hair, I carried a bouquet, and everything I wore was new, even my beautiful slippers. For rising action, we have, after having no family relatives left, Antoinette is married to Mr. Rochester through a financial agreement only. This agreement was done by Mr. Rochester and Mr. Mason. For Mr. Mason, this is to keep the Mason name going. For Mr. Rochester, this is for the money for him to keep. For our textual evidence, there we were, sheltering from the heavy rain under a large mango tree. Myself, my wife Antoinette, and the little case servant who was called Amelia. For our climax, it is when Mr. Rochester finally saw what he had done to Antoinette to challenge her sanity. He ignored her, he cheated on her on purpose, questioned her background and who she was. This is a textual evidence stated by Mr. Rochester when he saw Antoinette. I was too shocked to speak. Her hair hung uncombed and dull into her eyes, which were inflamed and staring. Her face was very flushed and looked swollen. Her feet were bare. For our following action, we have Mr. Rochester imprisoned Antoinette in his attic in England because of her uncontrollable madness. Here is our textual evidence. She is one of them, I too can wait for the day when she is only memory to be avoided, locked away, and like all memories, a legend or a lie. And finally, for our resolution, it is when after the third night of dreaming the exact same scenario of her taking the keys from Grace, the servant who is watching over her, taking a candle and burning the place down, she finally took it to reality and recreated the same scenario. The textual evidence, I waited a long time after I heard her snoring. Then I got up, took the keys and unlocked the door. I was outside holding my candle. Now at last I know why I was brought here and what I have to do. There must have been a draught because the flame flickered and I thought it was out. But I shielded it with my hand and it burned up again to light me along the dark passage. Alright, let us now move forward to our contemporary themes that we found in the novel. First is the concept of oppression and alienation towards white people. Kindly look at the textual evidence supporting our theme. Okay, so in this textual evidence, we could see that Antoinette and her family were really hated in their hometown. They were treated as white cockroaches, ostracized by the blacks given by the fact that they already lost their wealth and her father passing away. The consequences of alienation become both increasingly isolating as well as increasingly dire as the novel progresses. The tensions at the start of the novel are between groups, us versus them. Race and class differences lead an entire mob to burn down the house at Calabria, and the family escapes wounded but fortunately together. Over the course of the novel, however, the family is drawn apart, and by the end, Antoinette is alienated even from herself. Rochester denies her even her own identity by repeatedly calling her Bertha, and in her madness and captivity, she speaks of the ghost of a woman they say haunts this place, unaware that she is referring to herself. Although short-lived, we must say that woman courage was manifested in the novel. In the part wherein Christophine urged Antoinette to leave, Mr. Rochester exhibited courage. It displayed power, women reclaiming their power. However, because of the patriarchy built in our society, women who assert themselves are ultimately thwarted by the men. It eventually comes out that Christophine is wanted by Jamaican law enforcement for her practice of abaya, and Rochester plans to turn her in, which only shows that women would always be the victim of patriarchal society. The third contemporary theme that we read from the novel was Mr. Rochester twisting the truth of Antoinette's identity. This only shows how manipulative men are in handling women and how evident patriarch is. Rochester ultimately takes the path of denial by imprisoning Antoinette, shutting her away forever rather than reconciling the truth of her nature and their marriage with what he'd expected or been led to believe. Even before he addressed Antoinette with the name as Bertha or Marionette, because the name Antoinette reminded him of her mother's name, Annette. Even Christophine finally retreats into denial or refusal when Rochester and Antoinette leave for England. Rochester offers you can write to her, to which Christophine replies, "Read and write, I don't know, other things I know," and walks away without saying goodbye.
And here's the symbolism we found in the novel. First of all, the Sargasso Sea. Due to its proximity to Bermuda and general perception that it is lifeless, the Sargasso Sea is blamed for some infamous ship disappearances. Sargasso Sea alludes to Antoinette's predicament in which she is bound and immobile by a societal construct and is unable to escape. Antoinette floats between two cultures like the Sargasso Sea. European colonialism and the issues it left behind are to blame for her stranded situation. The Sargasso Sea continues to serve as the ideal metaphor for the perplexing and gloomy issues encountered during the perilous journey between the West Indies and Europe. Antoinette is the Sargasso Sea, that is an image of feminine searching for autonomy and identity. Although she struggles so hard, the woman never frees herself from the insidious and invincible tentacles of exploiter and the patriarchal conditioning that cling to her as to try to find her way to herself. Mirror. Mirrors are frequently mentioned by characters in the book as an external tool for establishing their identities, turning to them for comfort and overcoming their fears. Mirrors serving as the looking glasses, sincere looks, and a crystal clear pool of water are examples of embodiments that represent the hero's pursuit of identification. Women and their interactions with a society where social standing determines who they are frequently linked by an act looking in the mirror. They intend to learn more about themselves and validate their self image by looking at their reflections in it. When the family gets turned down by European wives, Annette says that she still planned and hoped. Perhaps she had to hope every time she passed a looking glass or mirror. Dresses in fine clothing, Annette sees herself as a socialite in the looking class, hoping to identify her with the European whites and regain her lost status among peers. Thornfield Hall. Thornfield Hall represents patriarchy. It came from Jane Eyre, where the depiction is used by Bront, who is aimed to a manner being consistent with Gothic in a tone of the novel as a whole. Under Brown's pen, it is an isolated mansion of unspecified size, with a number of apparently unused rooms. It becomes important to the narrative after the appearance of the madwoman, Bertha Mason. The name of the hall expresses and amplifies the sense of depression and malaise. Thornfield can literally be defined as a place where thorns grow. Thorn has its figurative meaning as full of trouble and difficulties. So Thornfield conveys a strong sense of trouble, misery, or distress. In Jane Eyre, it symbolizes the miseries and hardships Jane has to come through before her ultimate happiness. But for Antoinette, it turns out to be her living hell. Antoinette is held captive by Rochester at Thornfield. It stands for the wealth and patriarchal power of Rochester. It is comparable to the patriarchal society and system that physically and spiritually imprisons Antoinette. She is imprisoned in Thornfield's chilly, dark attic, where she is an insane and disoriented state since she is unable to tell time or place. Fragmented instances of the solitary visual images are all that she can recall. Thornfield Halls will perish, as Rochester puts it. Thornfield Hall, this accursed place, this stand of ancient, this insolent vault, offering the ghastliness of living death to the light of the open sky, this narrow stone hell, with its one real fiend, worse than a legion of such as we imagine. So, Antoinette burning Thornfield Hall down means breaking out from the system that captivated her. The destruction of Thornfield is significant because it symbolizes of Antoinette breaking down the patriarchy. It is the way that leads her back to freedom. In destroying the tyranny of the patriarchy, Antoinette has taken revenge on the patriarchal society and her white oppressor, and achieves her self-identity. The novel is titled Wide Sargasso Sea, based from the fact that Antoinette was trapped inside her mind. Sargasso Sea symbolizes detrimental situation in which the main character did not escape. Let us all be reminded that sometimes it is alright for us to swim in the Sargasso Sea. However, living in it will only make us captive through its big waves. All the unsaid feelings, untold traumas, and unresolved memories will drown us in expense of being free. This has been our novel analysis presentation of Wide Sargasso Sea. I am Leonardo Prudencio, and here's my partner, Jean C. Thank you for listening.